Hey, welcome to episode 2 of the TTSG podcast. I'm Lee, and in this episode I'll be interviewing Suzie Johnston to talk about writing narrative for tabletop games. Suzie Johnston goes by the author name of V.G. Thorne and is narrative lead for Goblin King Games, creators of the whimsical Skirmish tabletop game Moonstone. Suzie's an author, poet and avid gamer. She's the lead writer of the Moonstone books. Hopefully you're familiar with those. If not, you will be by the end of this podcast. As well as writing the books, Suzie also develops the world that Moonstone's set in. That's the world of Tauber. And on top of that, she also helps with character design, which is a key part of the whole world building experience that we'll be delving into during the podcast. The topic for this episode is writing narrative for tabletop games, and Suzie Johnston is the perfect person to have on for this. And if you're familiar with Moonstone, you'll know it's got a rich narrative running right through it. The scenarios are all linked with different stories, and the stories play out as you work your way through the different game books. I've really been looking forward to this podcast and having the opportunity to sit down with a narrative writer for tabletop skirmish games. So let's welcome our guest, Suzie Johnston. So let's start with tabletop games and how they can vary widely in terms of theme and setting. And so with that in mind, what attracted you to Moonstone and the world of Tauber in particular?
Yeah, so this takes us back quite a few years now, and now I think about it, it's a scary number of years ago, actually. So not long after Tom ran his very first Kickstarter, which was for the Fire Spitter, he ran a second Kickstarter, which was for the starter set. I think it's kind of like an expansion from the two. I wasn't actually involved in Moonstone at the time. I was just a punter. And I went to Salute in London and was wandering around and picking up the odd thing and spending too much money, as you always do, and went to the back of the hall and saw fairies on a display table and just thought, what? I've never seen fairies in a miniatures game before. And I kind of stared at them, and the friends I was with was like, "You're right." I was like, "That just looks really intriguing." And there's only one table and one guy, and he's talking to what I assume is a dad with a kid. And I don't really want to go and kick the dad and the kid off of the table to ask about it. So we kind of loitered and listened a bit, and it was Tom, and he was in full flow and talking to this guy. And I was like, oh, don't worry about it, we'll come back. And we carried on walking around, and I just couldn't get the fairies out of my head. So we did a circuit, and they're like, "Oh, do you want to head off?" I was like, "No, I want to go back to that stand." So we went back, and the same thing was happening, basically. Tom had someone else he was talking to, but I was like, "No, I'm just going to go and have a look." And there was a glass display with all of the miniatures that were available at the time, which isn't the full range that there is now. It's kind of quite a small handful, really, by comparison. And I just fell in love with the miniatures and chatted to Tom. It was just him. He had just one table with this glass display on the end, and he'd managed to blag a bit of shelf space from the next door stand so he could actually put his stock somewhere. And he didn't have any fairies left, yet he sold me the starter set and the humans, I think it was. And then my friend bought the goblins, and another friend bought gnomes. So we basically had enough to play together. And I bought the rule book as well, because convention deals and end of day, I was like, yes, I'm going to spend all of the money that I haven't spent already. And started to read the book on the way home, and was just flicking through it on public transport. I just thought, this just looks lovely. The illustrations on the box were just so captivating, and I started to read the stories in the rule book, and just loved the setting. Fantasy has appealed to me for a long time, since I was a kid. Actually, I've loved fantasy stories, and so it was just a kind of a match made in heaven, really, in terms of a miniatures game, and then getting hooked with it in that sense. So that's how I was introduced to Moonstone, and it was a long time ago now, something like 2018, 2017, something like that, I think.
So how long was it from then until you started working on the writing side of the game itself and being involved in that creative process with Tom?
Yeah, so actually, now I think about it, it was longer ago than that. I don't want to, I'm just going to try not to think about the numbers. But it was, I backed the next Kickstarter. So the Leschervault came as part of a next Kickstarter. I backed that. I was one of those people that went all in and backed the whole thing, and got the scenery and got all of those bits and pieces, and bought the little booklet of stories called the Treasures and Tyrants of Tauber. And again, saw some of the bits around it and just loved the stories that were being told. And I saw how open Tom was to the community, which was a lot smaller at the time, and he still is very chatty with the community, actually, even though we're much bigger now. Richie, who was the narrative lead at the time, he also was very chatty with people, and I listened to the podcast episodes that they'd been on, and I just had this idea in my head. I read the story about Brunhilde, and the way it was all kind of laying out with her and some of the other characters, and I just thought to myself, it'd be so much fun to do something slightly different. And so I messaged Richie on Facebook and just dropped him a note and said, I've got this headcanon about Brunhilde. It's in her bio in The Arising, and it's explored elsewhere. So if you haven't read it yet, this is a spoiler, but if you have, this will be familiar to you. But I said to him, I just have this idea that she is in love with Agatha. So rather than it being Fritz, who Agatha's obsessed with, there's this strange love triangle between people who have feelings for someone who doesn't return them or are oblivious to it. So I just feel like that'd be really fun and a really unusual dynamic. And he was like, "Oh, that's brilliant! I love it." So yes, let's make that happen. Yes, we're going to make that. That's Brunhilde's backstory. She's going to be in the Leschervault release, or she's part of that book of releases. So yes, she's coming out, and so that will work. I was like, great. And something made me follow that up with, and I don't know why I did, but something made me follow up with that and say to him, I kind of fancy myself as a bit of a writer. So if you ever need any help or anything, then yeah, sure, I'll lend a hand. And I was expecting it to be one of those messages where you get a thanks very much. If something comes up, then we'll be in touch. And thanks but no thanks sort of thing. But he replied, and I think it must have just been a perfect time to get in touch, basically. And he replied and said, actually, yes, we need some help. It would be great to have a chat with you and have a different perspective come into the world. I'd be happy to read through some of your stuff. So send me some things you've written, just so that we can do a little bit of a check. And then, yes, I'd be happy to do it. And so I sent him. I'd never shared any of my work with anyone before.
Oh, wow. Right.
So I really was just, putting myself out there in a way I'd never done before. And I asked my now husband, then partner, could you please read through this and just tell me I'm not making myself out to be something that I'm not. And a friend of mine is a fabulous editor. And I sent her some stuff and said, look, I know you'll be honest. If it's terrible, tell me, and then I'll kind of graciously withdraw my offer. And both of them said, why have you not shared this with us before? This is amazing. And I was like, all right, okay. They're probably just being nice for us, and it. And Richie liked it, and I got involved writing some of the bios for the Arising book. And then unfortunately life got in the way and Richie decided to step back as narrative lead. But fortunately for me, that meant that I was asked to step up. So Tom asked me to take that role, and I just grabbed hold of it and have helped Tom flesh out his world and get the stories down on paper. For about 4 years now, I think. Yeah, it was kind of just before COVID, I think, that I kind of signed up, and then we were working through it. So yeah, it's been a while now that I've been working on it. Now I think about it, but yeah, it was an unusual way to get in, I think, but it worked out very well for me in the end.
Yeah, it sounds like good timing. And then being able to get involved with the world building while the game is still developing is really awesome. And I guess with like world building in mind, how do you approach it with tabletop skirmish games? 'Cause I know with world building, it's a huge part of like RPGs, but with tabletop skirmish games, although it is something that's included in most games, I think Moonstone really goes into it a bit deeper. So how do you approach it for a skirmish game?
Yeah, I think that is partly my fault. So I have to world build whenever I'm doing anything. So I have played D&D and Pathfinder and other RPGs for a number of years, and have been GM for various games as well. And whenever I do that, I have to understand the world and the context that I'm running a game in order to feel like I'm running the game well for my players. And I think I brought that along with me to Moonstone. So wanting to really understand how the world worked and be able to answer any questions that players had of us about the world itself, and just to flesh out for people for their enjoyment as much as kind of mine. And I did come in when the world was already set up, so there was an awful lot of groundwork already done. And really what I came in and did was to ask Tom a lot of annoying questions that he either hadn't thought about before, or he had but just weren't recorded anywhere, and then just started to record all of those things. So how long various races live for, and why certain events happen, and how people feel about certain cultural things, and what cultural differences there are, and the religions. So knowing that Les Cheval was one of them, so what does that mean for other religions, and that sort of thing. So I think it was probably my love of building worlds that has helped us document it more, and the ambition that Tom and Richie had with The Arising to make this a full novel, and have it as the first of a story, a series of stories, meant that the world needed to be documented and formed much more to actually understand why people care about things, and where conflicts lie, and where situations arise that need to be resolved, and why they need to be resolved, and why this person thinks it needs to be resolved but that person doesn't, and all of the history behind those decisions and the relationships between people. And I've been documenting that over the last few years, but with a strong awareness that the most important thing is the gameplay. It's absolutely the most important thing, and then the miniatures probably come second, and then all of the lore and the world building does come third, and that's the order it should be for a skirmish game. And I like to think what I do is the kind of the icing on top that makes it much different from other types of games, and allows people to really kind of get invested and enjoy the whole experience of eating this particular skirmish game cake, rather than a different skirmish game cake, that they are slightly different.
So how do you record all this? Have you got lots of notes that people would never have seen, I guess? Do you have like a matrix where things are connected?
Yeah, we have our own wiki. It is nowhere near complete. There are pages that are completed, or as complete as they can be right now, before other characters come out and other situations happen. But there are also a lot of pages which just have a couple of lines written on them, just as a reminder of things that I've thought about, or that we've discussed, and we want to make sure we record it somewhere. But yes, we have quite an extensive wiki. So every released character and every upcoming character that we've decided on has their own page, which has their own more in-depth bio than you find in the books. So their histories and their relationships with the characters, both published and that aren't in the game, so parents and friends and anyone else that's significant, which gives us a pool of other characters to draw on if we really wanted to. But then what I've also tried to do is to make sure they are tied together as much as possible, so that someone isn't completely by themselves and doesn't have any connections with any other characters, because that would be a little bit strange. So I've tried to make sure that that's there. But then there's also pages on locations and on religions and on cultures and races individually as well, just to try and capture some of that. So it's quite big, and I think we won't release it anytime soon. But I think that it would be a shame for it to go to waste. So I suspect there might be things in future that we will do with it to really flesh out this stuff in people's minds, for those that want to read a bit more about the world and all of those things that I've thought about when I've been walking down the road and thinking, oh, there's this thing that I should really figure out, and then talk it through with Tom, and we agree, and then make a record in the wiki.
That's awesome. That's really cool. But I think the characters with Moonstone, they almost feel like they're real. You really get that sense from it, which is something quite unusual, especially in skirmish games. It feels like almost like a book that's come alive. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
How I
kind of awesome.
Get it. Yeah. But how do you go about creating those characters so that they are memorable and relatable, so that players do get that connection? How did you do?
So I'm lucky in the sense that I have characters to work with. So as I say, the most important thing is the gameplay, and we are working on our book 3 characters at the moment. So we've released a couple of box sets from it already, and we have the Kickstarter that's coming up in a month or so's time now for the Shades faction. So for those people listening in future, that's where we are right now. And right at the start of the process, so once the second book was done, it was me, Tom, and Joe, who's the game developer. The 3 of us got together, and we talked about the ideas that we all had already for the different characters that would make sure that there was a balance with all of the different factions that were coming out, so that everyone who plays a different faction and also a keyword or sub-faction within those factions felt like they were getting something new. So that's really what steered that kind of development side of things. And then we basically just talked through ideas we already had, or maybe ideas from the community as well, and then to fill the gameplay need. But really, they come about from this would be really cool, let's see if we can work it out sort of perspective. So for some of the characters I write about, they were already kind of in production or on their way. So when I joined to write for the Arising, the second book, I already had characters and I had miniatures to look at, and just get a sense of who they were from looking at those illustrations or looking at those miniatures, and forming their characters just basically off of that and the feel I got from them, and also thinking, oh, wouldn't it be cool to do this with them? So having Jada and Hoff as old friends, and having there's a rivalry between them in their bios in the Arising, and just having that dynamic between them, and then Mr. Toodles, who's the third character in that box set, then kind of being a slightly unusual member of the community, and he's playing like a pipe in his miniature. Actually thinking, well, he's supposed to be, he kind of looks a bit like a hippie, but he's also like a college age kid. So we were thinking about him as being a bit like a hipster type character. I was like, one of the things that he would be doing is playing really weird music because he's that kind of rebellious teenager age, and that's where the Goblin jazz funk fusion thing came from. Was just that kind of extension of those kind of characters and those leads. So when they already exist, that's kind of how I do it. But with brand new characters, it's been great to work amongst the three of us to really work out characters that's best for gameplay, but then for me to also now be able to say, well, I've had this idea or I've been working on this thing, can we turn that into a character, and can it work? Or if I say I've had this idea and I've been writing which I think would be great for this particular character, is there something we can do with what's spawned from that? And that's helped to influence some of the gameplay and some of the character creation for the game itself, as well as the actual lore writing side of the characters. So that's been quite fun. So there's been all sorts of ways that we've approached creating the characters, both from the gameplay and the lore perspective, and it's been a really nice kind of mesh of the approaches to generate them, which has been so much fun to do. I am lucky. I know how lucky I am to be doing this. It is a lot of fun.
And the stories in the book are awesome, aren't they? And how you use like dialogue to get the characters talking, because it really sets a tone for when you start playing the scenarios then. But how do you come up with the dialogue? Do you imagine the characters like talking to each other? How does it work?
Yeah, so the way I tend to write is I get scenes in my head, and then and so it's like a film playing in my head, and so the dialogue is quite often what comes first. And then also a descriptor within the location as well, or maybe an entire scene. So the prologue for the Arising, which is the three witches, basically bringing a dead witch, a previous Leshavult priestess spirit, into the skull that ends up going onto Callista's head. Just those scenes of the three of them doing those things is what it made me end up writing those, and then the kind of the spells, the chants that they say kind of came off the back of that. But anything that's dialogue heavy does play out a little bit like a scene in my head, and so I try to think about how would I feel or how much would I enjoy this if I were watching it as a TV show or as a film, something like that, and how does it work in that sense. Then all of the kind of minutiae of describing reactions, like facial reactions or the way that people move and what they do, is then a careful balance, because sometimes you can add in too many reactions, so people can be nodding so much they're like a nodding dog, like in a car you get those head bobbly things, that they can be doing that too much because you say that they nodded in response. And I also have been told by my friend who's my editor that I do like a crackling fire. And so there's times where you can be overly descriptive, and so I've learnt a lot about actually paring down what I write and learning how to describe things in a slightly more cohesive and a slightly tighter way, so that it is enjoyable and has that pace to it, so it does feel like a film or a TV show, something like that.
So with all this narrative and all the stories and everything, have you made any like conscious decisions that allow players to shape their own story when they play?
Yeah, the way that the game runs actually allows for that. So the fact that it's a skirmish game and it's a bunch of people coming together to dig up moonstones because they want to get money from the Elrich, who are the wizards who are paying people for these stones. That is just a situation. It's a situation where people do come across other factions, and then they fight and hope to end up with the most moonstones. So it kind of naturally lends itself to that. And what I hope is that the stories that I write, the fluff that goes alongside the different characters, just gives them some extra flavour behind what they're doing. So the game is quite narrative in the way it runs as well. So Tom's experience with HEMA, historical medieval fighting, and the way that the card mechanic of melee works, you can make it very descriptive with the way that there are swings and guards and all that kind of stuff. So then I'm hoping that the way that one character feels about another one, because people understand the lore, just allows them to have that fun in that moment and to insult people appropriately, or to offer support to someone else as needed, or to kind of draw on something that's happened in the narrative, say, oh, you're a traitor, and you're a traitor from this thing. So I'm hoping that that's something that people can do with what I write. And then obviously we had the Fate of Eric community campaign last year, which dramatically influenced a particular character's journey. So we have done that, and we might do it again in future. No plans just yet, but it worked so well. It would be good to be able to do something like that again.
And was that guided by the community? Was it the community would give you like feedback, or they had options? How did that work with Eric?
Yeah, so we have Eric the Squire. So anyone with the starter set will be very familiar with Eric. He is a fan favourite, and Tom said as soon as he created this teenager, basically, he thought he has to grow up at some point. He has to become a knight, and his ambition throughout all of the previous narrative, his kind of direction would naturally take him to be a Commonwealth knight, and to have his dreams of being that kind of knight in shining armour kind of realised. But Tom didn't want to necessarily go down that route, and we talked about actually it would be really fun for the community to influence which of the three factions that were available at the time, which of those three he would end up aligning to. And when we were talking about it, it's like, well, it makes sense for him to become a knight at this particular stage, because the Shades are just about to be released as a faction, or we're a year away from being released. And the way that the Arising ends, there's a particular character that's cropped up, and he needs to be dealt with in the third book. And so having a champion makes sense. And then we will take Eric through his journey in the third book. So the way the community aspect worked was we had 3 versions of Eric the Squire, which were somewhere between Eric the Squire and Eric the Knight of the 3 different factions. And people had the option of playing with these temporary Erics, and played against each other, ran them as sanctioned games. They agreed with their opponent it would be recorded. Everyone could record up to 2 games. I can't remember if it was 2. I don't think it was 2 games a week. I think it was 2 games during the particular phase that we had. And we had over 200 games recorded throughout the period that we have played, which was fantastic, and went completely beyond what we were expecting. And there are some free stories that are still available on the website. The Fate of Eric story is still there for people to read, and I wrote that to be released as there were the phases of the campaign. So the kind of the introduction, then there were 3 phases, which allowed me to write about the 3 different factions, Eric making his decision, why he might not choose the Commonwealth, why the others might be more suitable for him, and then depending on which of the factions were voted on, that then absolutely dictated which of the factions he was going to go into, which had the potential to completely change his narrative course, not only for his future but actually for his past as well, because there needed to be his choice. So I said to Tom when we were talking about it, so it has to feel like it's Eric's choice. So the way that I present it can't be, he can't lose the agency behind that decision, because it reflects the player's choice that he's made this decision to go in this direction. I have to reflect that in the way that it's presented back. And so we had to then think, well, if it's his choice, what other things could influence that decision that maybe he doesn't know about, or he does know about because he's gone through some experiences. And so there were things that we set up for potentially for his past. So if one of the factions was chosen, there would have been an implication for his bloodline, which hasn't happened because that's not the path that the players chose. So that was a huge example of the community absolutely steering his past and his future, and now I have a Leshavult Eric to play with, which is fun. Yeah, I know, it's amazing. And a massive elk to write into the story as well, and to give the elk some personality too, which is always fun. Trying not to make him too much like the frozen reindeer. It's fun. There's a huge amount to be done with that, and he's such an important character, and people care about him so much, then I have to treat him with the same kind of care and respect in his stories now as well. So trying to make sure that's nice and robust is something that I'm working on now, even though the book 3 stuff is only just started now. I'm waiting for more of the characters to be finished before I start writing the final or the next part of the narrative for book 3.
Brilliant. I love it. I hope you do it again. It would be so good to be involved, because obviously that one, it would be great to be involved in it in the future. But that's awesome. But so I mean, that's what tabletop gaming's all about, isn't it? You all get together and you all like tell the story out as you play the game, and I think that's awesome. But I think from like behind the scenes with the creators, the rule writers, the artists, and you, the narrative writer, how do you all work together? How do you collaborate to make sure that it comes across, and then you get a cohesive and engaging experience for the player?
Yeah, so we are lucky in a way because we are such a small team. So Tom kind of dabbles in everything as he would do. He's the creator and managing director, and he cares so much about the game. He's so passionate about the game, the community, and making it right for people. And then Joe came on board roughly the same time I did, maybe a little bit later, and he was brought in to be the game developer. So as I was brought in to be the narrative lead. Beginning of last year, the three of us sat in a room. And we talked about the story, the potential characters that were coming up, any that might be a problem, any that maybe would or wouldn't work, or where there were gaps. And that really, we just worked together. We worked through it all in that one session. And then we tried a few different tools to help us keep working together. So we have our wiki that we work on, and we can leave each other comments. But actually, we have our own Discord server. We experimented with other tools, but for us, because there's such an active Moonstone Discord community, we kind of thought, well, we're kind of there a lot during the day anyway, so we might as well make our own. And so the three of us, and now Mick, who started at the beginning of this year as the kind of office manager, the four of us are in there, and we talk to each other all the time. And Joe has a very active playtest community within the Moonstone community. So there's a group of people who are fantastic and work through early versions of miniatures and of what we've got planned, and then takes the feedback on board. And I tend to get involved in the early stages when we're talking about maybe the names of characters or abilities, and also the art direction as well. So Tom makes the final decision on everything, but he does talk to us, and he does gather feedback from us and ideas from us, and then brings all of that together. And that's kind of how they all pull together, and we all give our thoughts and feedback and make the decisions. But it's Tom always makes the final decisions on things, but it's kind of names of things that I influence maybe a little bit more, and then Joe absolutely influences the gameplay a bit more, and then we all give a little bit of feedback on art direction, just to tweak things and to help Tom make decisions, because sometimes we get a sheet of images back of these incredible initial drawings by the artist and just think, oh, which one do we pick? And then have to talk about the different options and which one we like and or what combination could work well.
That's interesting with the abilities, how everyone has an input to bring it together with the name, and then how it affects the game as well, the mechanics. That's
yes.
Yeah.
So the way that the game will work is usually kind of pinned down, and then we just look at the character, or we try and think of maybe how something has been inspired, and then we will kind of adjust the net. So Joby, who's a relatively new release, one of the goblins, Joby is kind of a nickname of Joe, so he's kind of named after Joe. But then his character is a lot like Del Boy, who's a British comedy, staple character. He's a big character for possibly people over a certain age, but certainly through like the 80s and 90s, he was a big character. So his design is very influenced by Del Boy, and then the names of the abilities are taken from other British comedy or British sitcoms as well. So like That's Mine, This Is Mine is Cat from Red Dwarf and that sort of thing. So it's quite nice to be able to filter some of those things in and add those that level of influence behind some of the stuff. But naming characters can sometimes be really simple, and sometimes can take forever for us to figure out, or just to make sure it's right. I think it's like when you get a pet, and you're like, I've kind of got an idea for a name, and then you look at them and you think, oh no, you don't look like that. I'm gonna have to figure out a new name for you. And then you're like, oh no, it's this. Yeah, you're definitely that.
So Joe's got a character like named after them.
Yes, yeah.
And what about you? Have you got a character that you've influenced?
No. Not yet. Not yet. I mean, fingers crossed in future I will do. But actually, I'm quite content to heavily influence character choices anyway. Liv, who's also a newish one, she's the rune casting gnome. That came about because I said to Tom it would be really cool to have a fortune teller, and then we wanted to go. We were looking at the Norse box and wanting a third character for it, and had a few other ideas elsewhere. And that's when it's like, oh, actually, we can move her into the Norse box, make her an older gnome, and then she's a rune reader rather than a tarot card reader, which is where she started out. So. It's those kind of situations. And Dranya, actually, that again, a new release has just come out at the moment. She came about because probably a couple of years ago now, someone innocently asked in the Discord server whether there was an April Fool's on Tauber. And so there's no simple questions like that when you're a world builder, because I was like, well, yeah, there probably is. I was like, but where would it come from? Why would there be an April Fool's? And it wouldn't be April Fool's because the months aren't the same. They have their own thing. So where did April Fool's come from here, and how would it come about there? And I was like, oh, well, it's a whole trickster thing, and the fairies are very tricksty. So yes, it would be a fairy thing. And it wouldn't just be a day, because the fairies do like going over the top with stuff. So it's not just a day; it's a whole week. So I was like, yes, there is. It's called Trickster Week. That's what the response they had, but that was the thing that went on in my head. Then that carried on from there, and I was like, well, trickster stuff. I was like, there's no tricksters in Tauber yet. And I was just thinking about the gods and other spirits, and with Leshavult or Leshavit, who is the god. Leshavult is the cult that follows him, although there is a second half of the followers who are just the followers of Lesh, who aren't cultists. They just follow Leshavit, but they get lumped into the same pile by everybody else. So Jada and Hoff, for example, I've already mentioned, they aren't cultists, but they are followers of Lesh. So that's why they will work with other cultists, because there's that religious connection. Anyway, it's a tangent. See, that's what happens when you're a world builder. You go on tangents.
You just need a little prompt.
Yeah, just need a little prompt. Yeah, and then go back. So it was thinking about other religions, and also thinking about shades and knowing that they were going to come up, and the fact that they were undead. was like, well, undead, inherently bad. Unlikely that anyone's going to be particularly impressed by people coming back from the dead in that kind of way. But why not? Who would have a problem with it, and why? And so I was thinking about all of the gods in all of those connections, and I thought a trickster would just suit the fairies. So they worship Diana, their queen, is a living god, but they are also beings of nature, so they respect other natural creatures or natural spirits. So I thought, with this trickster week, it makes sense to have a trickster god or a trickster demigod spirit. And so I was like, okay, let's go with this. And I was like, oh, and foxes are usually trickster creatures in European folklore. And I was like, so it makes sense for this character to be linked with that. But I was like, then the shape-shifting side of thing would be perfect, because that's so often, if you think about Loki, you think about characters from all across global religions and folklore, it's always a shapeshifter. I was like, yeah, she's got to be. And so this character of Dranya came up from that, but only as a nature spirit. And then when we were talking about book 3 and where we had some gaps, we would talk about things, and she was just in my head, and I said to Tom, it would be amazing to have a shape-changing miniature that was halfway through changing from one thing into another, and that it has a lot of potential for future, potentially limited edition miniatures and that kind of stuff. And he was like, yeah, you're right, it would. And so that's how she ended up being a now recently released character, was actually the lore and an innocent question from someone in the community, how that ended up creating this miniature that's now just been released and looks incredible. She's she's got so much character in her miniature, and that's partly because we understood where she was coming from as well, and that journey to go through. And so that was an awful lot of fun to be able to create her.
It's brilliant, isn't it? Just one question can lead to that. I love it. It's so cool to get like an insight into it. It's brilliant. Yeah.
And my brain, and as so you can see the way it's like, oh, tangent, there's a thing, question, and then that,
yeah. So a lot of writers use like prompts, don't they? Do you use that a lot in the process? Do you get?
Yes. So I have a skeleton for book 3, for example. So I have certain beats that I know I need to hit, which I had for the Arising as well. I think it started off as something like 8 chapters, and then it went up to about 13, just because there were things that needed to be told and explained. And I wrote a chapter and it was far too long, and so we split it into 2 and that sort of thing. And so I do leave myself prompts and use various kind of methods to make sure I write about the right things and cover relevant stuff off in narrative and in the story. I use a variety of different tools to help me get to that point.
Brilliant. Let's stick with writing tips for a bit then, because I think there's going to be loads of people out there who've always wanted to write a book, or in particular wanted to write like a game, be it an RPG or a skirmish game. So let's go through a few things with the writing tips. And a lot of people like start off with a blank page or a blank screen. And what would you advise them to do when they get to that stage? How do they start? If they've never done it before and they've just got that sheet of paper in front of them, what should they do?
So what I tend to do, not thinking about Moonstone necessarily, because it was a slightly different situation maybe, but if I was starting completely from scratch, what I tend to do is to write a scene. So I've done this for a short story that I've written that's going to be published in an anthology. I've done it for a series that I have started writing and haven't finished yet, and also in a novella that I've just finished and going through editing on now. With each of those, I wrote the opening scene or chapter or whatever it was to get a feel for, can it go anywhere? do I feel like if I read this, I'd want to read more? Does it have legs, basically, or am I just writing it and it's really awkward and it's just not flowing? And I do that to get that sense before then thinking, right, well, where can I take this story? Where is this idea going? And then that's when I might plan things out. So there are different styles of writers. There are pantsers who write by the seat of their pants. There are planners who plan everything out and then write based on their plan. I'm more of a pantser than a planner, but I will plan things out when I know there are things I want to write, and I need to make sure I write them down in note form before I get there, so I don't forget like this core thing happening. And so that's how I go about writing, and I would say that would be how I would approach world building as well. So if creating a game world, that's how I would start it. So think about that concept and write a like an opening, a prologue to a book, basically, almost to write that, give that sense of the world and what's going on in the game, and the different factions or the different houses, whatever they're called, how they do all align or not, and again where the conflicts are, because conflict is where stories live. It's the most important part of any story, is actually where the problems are that have to be solved, or the tensions between relationships and what happens off the back of them. And then once you understand that kind of concept, you can then start building the world a little bit more off of that. So those sorts of questions that I was asking myself about Trickster Week, and have asked about lots of different things like the undead and all of those sorts of things, is how do people in this world feel about it? Who is fine with it? Who has a problem with it? Who doesn't really care? Why do they feel all of those different ways? How has that been formalized in an institution somehow? What religions maybe is off the back of that, or how are people educated or not? What's the military like? And it's all of those different aspects I gradually build, and I mean it's kind of fun. It can be very absorbing, and steal time away from writing. So I have to make sure I don't get too distracted with that and actually do writing as well. But I find that I will write about something, I will write for a while, and then think, I've just found something I have to answer in this world before I can write about how my characters react to it. And I would say it's probably similar to the world building aspect of a game as well, is to think, well, how do Space Marines react to Tyranids showing up, or like in Moonstone, how do the Commonwealth feel about the Dominion, or how do gnomes feel about fairies, and going down to that kind of quite specific level, and then thinking, well, actually there are Norse gnomes, so they are different from Tauber gnomes, so how did they feel about things? It's slightly different, but not fully. And just asking those questions to build the world. And I would 100% recommend a book called Wonder Book, which is laid out in a slightly mad way, but reflects how my brain works when I write, and has loads of these strange little diagrams and illustrations and action points and ideas and further resources, but it just breaks down different aspects of writing. And for anybody who's studying or who wants to go on and do it, I would absolutely recommend that as a source book if you can get hold of it.
Brilliant. I'll put a link down below, so
yeah,
find it really easy. Nice one. That's great. So do you think it would be like an easy thing to fall into, where you do too much world building and not enough for writing? Is that an easy trap to fall into, you think?
I think it could be, because you're writing anyway, so you're having to write to do the world building, and so it is possible to do that. So I find myself sometimes fleshing out the bios in the wikis for some of the characters that we've already released. And I think, okay, I do need to record it. It does need to be done. But actually, I also need to be progressing things forward a little bit. So I think that's the balance that you need to find and need to work out what's right for you as a balance is, am I moving things forward enough whilst also kind of just filling the way as I go along to make sure I can refer back to something in future. I think that's knowing that you can check yourself, check your own notes, check your own workings out is helpful. So sometimes I will answer something in my head and not write it down, and then I regret it later and I think, oh, I know I figured this out, but I can't remember how I figured it out, and now I've written this thing, and I'm just going to trust my past self that I was right, but actually making a note at the time would have been helpful.
That's awesome. So what's your favourite part of the whole writing process? What do you like the most?
Oh, apart from when it's completely finished and people are reading it and like it, which is always terrifying. Even now, I still worry that people don't like things. I think it is the actual writing process and getting it down and transferring these images from my brain into words on paper. I really, really enjoy that process of that kind of laying things onto a page. Editing is a necessary evil that I both love and hate at the same time. I've mentioned her already. My friend Katie is an amazing editor, and she edited the Arising book for me, and we spent a lot of time together working on it, and she can be very brutal at times. We're very good friends, so I've told her to do it. So I don't want her to sound like a dragon, because I told her to do it because I wanted to be a better writer, and she didn't hold back, and my writing is better for it. But there's like a moment when you're editing where something just clicks, where it just falls into place. You think, yes, that is better. This reads better. This situation is now better. This process has made this better. That's a nice moment. It's like if you've got a click in your elbow or something and then it suddenly goes. It's that kind of feeling. Painful to get there, but then it's great once it's happened. And then the releasing it and having great feedback is wonderful when people do actually enjoy what you've spent a long, long time creating. And sharing stories is just amazing. That is probably my favourite thing, actually, is just sharing stories and perpetuating words and creativity and building this world and sharing it with people.
So if you had to recommend just one story or one piece that you've worked on, so that everyone listening could check it out and get a sense of your style and your approach to storytelling, what would it be? And where could they find it?
Yeah, well, if people would like to spend a little bit of money, then I would encourage you to buy The Arising, which is a full novel set in the Moonstone world. And then some of the bios, I didn't write all of the bios in The Arising, but I wrote probably about 90% of them. So you can get that sense from there and see where we're going with the next couple of books as well after that one. But if you wouldn't like to spend any money, you do just want to dip your toe, there is the Fate of Eric campaign story that's still available to download for free, and available to listen to as well on YouTube. So you could go and have a listen to that if you want to see what my narrative style is like.
Brilliant. I'll put some links to those too, so that people can find it easily. So what projects are you working on right now that you think people can keep an eye out on, and any sneak peeks for us?
Yeah, so we are working on the Kickstarter release at the moment. We are releasing a similar booklet of stories in the way that we did with the Leschevault Kickstarter. So there was the Treasures and Tyrants of Tauber book then. We're going to have a study on the Shades as written by Tabby the Librarian. So that will be a little booklet of story, or a story that's available to Kickstarter backers, or some Kickstarter backers. I don't know which level will get it for free, but it will be available as an add-on for others. So there's that, but then also forming the story that will come into book 3, the story beats that will be hit, and then developing the characters that we have already got the artwork and things for. So it was another little spoiler. I can't resist this one. So I referred earlier on to how sometimes the lore will create the character. And we had a spot for a monster box in the Shades faction for the Kickstarter that we were all working on, doing our different things, and it wasn't quite clicking. That kind of click wasn't quite happening. And I wanted to start writing some of the bits for the third book, the bits I could do. And I wrote this, or I had an idea for a piece, and I wrote it as it's going to be the prologue for the third book, which, again, spoilers, the character that comes back at the end of book 2. So the Elrich raise this character who is the Forgotten King, this very evil, benevolent dictator ruler from centuries before. They accidentally raise him, and the prologue is about him and how he ends up becoming the Forgotten King. And as part of it, I just thought, he's evil and unpleasant, and Moonstone isn't evil and unpleasant. It is whimsical. And so he needs to have something that just makes him less creepy. And I was like, what would make him less creepy is if he really wanted like a safety blanket. I was like, and he was a prince and then a king, and so the natural safety blanket for him would be a nanny. And then I had Count Duckula come into my head.
No I love Count.
with Nanny, and how she looked after Ducky Boo and kind of toddled around after him. And I just thought, yeah, he's going to want to bring back his nanny, or he's going to have wanted to have protected her. And so that's a big spoiler for you. His nanny is one of the characters, and she's quite creepy. I'm not going to spoil it anymore, but she's quite creepy, and but she's brilliant, and is going to be a fun one to carry on writing about, I think. And also their relationship, and how there's probably going to be some fairly dramatic moments just completely ruined by the fact that his nanny is now there. And yeah, doing the thing that kind of overprotective nannies probably do when they're also undead and have been alive or unalive for a very long time. Probably gone slightly strange.
I can't wait for it. It's so cool. It sounds awesome. So lots to look forward to. That's really great. So there's loads in the pipeline, and it's going to be fun sharing it with everybody. But this has been really cool. I've really enjoyed this, and hopefully everyone listening has really had an insight into the whole process and how you work. And thanks so much for being part of such a great game and making it so much fun. Loads of people I know are enjoying it. And so, really appreciate all the work that you're doing behind the scenes to get that across to everybody. And thanks so much for talking today. It's been awesome.
It has. Thank you very much for inviting me on. I've really enjoyed talking about it. It's one of those slightly more hidden elements, I think, of game design. So it's really nice to be able to come on and witter about it and give you a slight insight into the strange way that my world building writing brain works.
Thank you so much for listening to the TTSG podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback, so add your comments down below or drop me an email to Lee, that's Lee, at tabletopskirmishgames.com. Writing is the mirror to our thoughts, the bridge to our imagination, and the legacy we leave behind. So let's end this podcast with a quote, and in the words of Maya Angelou, there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. As we wrap up the podcast, I hope that it gives you the inspiration to tell your own stories through Tabletop Skirmish Games. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you'll join me for episode 3 of the TTSG podcast.